Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today we're welcoming Jonathan Foster. Jonathan is the partner of one, father of three, author, podcaster, lowercase t theologian with some degrees, founder of lovehaiti.org, and a lover of mountains, and Colorado School of Mines, and in general, a solvum probler extraordinaire. Find out more at jonathanfosteronline.com. Let's welcome Jonathan to the show. All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and today I'm pleased to be welcoming Jonathan Foster to the show. Hey, and welcome.
Hey, welcome to you. Thanks so much for thanks so much for having me back on. Appreciate it, and it's great to see you, man.
We're hoping to do this in person last week at the conferences we were a part of, but Jonathan is just such an important figure that I just could not pull him off the many panels and speaking elements he had, and I had other things, unfortunately. So we're doing this virtually here. So appreciate your time and making some time to have this conversation.
Absolutely. Sorry it didn't work out in person. That's goofy when we were together. Couldn't make it happen, but oh well, we got the technology, and I'm thankful to have a conversation either way.
Right. So you've been on the pod before, but give a summary of just kind of, if you can, of your background, faith journey, that kind of thing.
Sure. Well, I've been a church planter most of my life. That served me really well. I enjoyed doing that. Hopefully I served it well.
Yeah.
And then my theology kind of shifted and changed and morphed, but went through a lot of loss, including the loss of our daughter about 9 years ago and 4 months ago. And that really just kind of fast-tracked me. There's a lot of questions I had to respond to. And so as I was trying to have intellectual honesty with all of that, stuff just kind of picked up speed and didn't work really well with my denomination, my former denomination. They asked me to leave. And so that's been a really interesting journey, and it's really absurd, but I'm also quite grateful for it. I'm thankful for where I came from. I'm not bitter towards them. I think it was silly, but I'm also thankful. And then I got a partner of 34 years, and we have a couple boys who are now in their 20s and have kind of grown up in all of this shifting, changing stuff. So that's been fun and meaningful to process it with them. And I'm an author and a podcaster, and I run a nonprofit down in Haiti. And I'm involved in way too many things.
Yeah, the big fancy title for Jonathan Foster's podcast. Here, give it to us.
What? What is it?
Jonathan Foster, right?
Jonathan_Foster?
The podcast. That's the big fancy name, right?
Yeah, that's my big fancy name, Jonathan_Foster, because all the cool names like Future Christian were taken. And what are you going to do, man? So I just went with it.
Yeah. What's a spiritual practice that's been meaningful for you of late?
Probably the most important spiritual practice for me over the last, really my whole life, but certainly the last 9 to 10 years has been getting out, hiking when I'm out in your part of the country. I can call it hike when I'm in Kansas City, but you know, it's kind of embarrassing. It's really more of a walk or a run.
A walk on gravel.
That's right. We have some nice parks here, but not a lot of incline or decline. So getting out and doing that has probably been the most important thing. I often think about exercise as a way to exorcise the stuff I got going on inside of me. And the physiological and the spiritual, as you know, are all entangled. And so there's no delineating between the two. So it's a really important time for me.
Man, I know that. Yesterday, I came home just really exhausted from mental and physical grind this week, but I got on the treadmill and just kept going because I was like, oh, I'm exhausted, but this feels good.
Yep. Yeah, that's how that works. Yep, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to bring Jonathan on the show because Jonathan is a part of this pretty recent formation of a clergy network called Open Table Network. And as I understand it, it's kind of a new credentialing source. Is that fair to say?
We're not sure what to call it. It's opentable.network. It's funny. We started it together, myself and my friend Dana Hicks, and also Jennifer Miles and Guy Taylor. And so the four of us were all kind of in similar positions. Jennifer and Guy more coming from chaplaincy and needing to be reordained, recredentialed for their positions, but also wanting to do it in a place that was affirming. Both Dana and I having been very much moved out of our former places because we were trying to be affirming to the LGBTQ plus community. So, yeah, sometime in 23, we said, well, what? Maybe we just need to start something for us and invite others. And so it's grown from there. And it is a place to be credentialed, to be licensed if you want. It's a place for resources. We've started a cohort just so pastors have a safe space, and chaplains and counselors. Those are the three kind of main groups, so that they have a safe space to process the, as you know, the really awkward, weird space we all occupy in this like post-modern age that we live in.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you, and I had Jonathan, I'm saying that weird. I want to talk to Jonathan today on the show just because I think this is such an interesting development, kind of in light of what you even just said, our context in postmodernity, when we think about the decline of institutions. So this is kind of going to be a wide-ranging conversation. So I hope it'll make sense to you and for our listeners, Jonathan. You kind of share that the big impetus, it sounds like, was folks who've been to use, a strong word like excommunicated, whether intentionally or implicitly, from their faith tradition. As this thing has begun to take shape, like, what are the primary folks? Is it folks who no longer fit in their faith tradition? Like, what are the primary folks who are coming to this network?
Sure, it's very interesting because I think that theologically there are deeper issues than just the queer affirming issue, but that has become kind of the flashpoint, and so I would say we're brand new. I mean, we're only a few months old, and there's maybe 30 or 40 people kind of connected. There's maybe at this point only like 15, maybe 20. I'm not even sure licensed through it. But I think, as far as I know, everyone, like, that's the main thing, that they either were, officially excluded from their former theological, ecclesiological space, or we'll put it this way, they knew their time was coming. I mean, they just, you saw the writing on the wall, and so they're coming because of that. But, to me, there are that affirming queer theology stuff really just stems from, as far as I'm concerned, like a posture of love, a posture of uncontrolling, non-binary, non-violent, non-scapegoating, uncontrolling love. And so for me, that's really the deeper issue. But a lot of people find themselves here because the other, it gets so much news and so much traction.
Yeah. So practically speaking, if I can ask, like, what was the formation look like? Did you all just like form a nonprofit and register as a church type thing?
Basically, yes. It's funny because I just talked to a new friend. Her name's Elle Pike. She's from Canada, and they're doing something very similar. They started probably about 2 years ago, but we had to laugh because she's taken 2 years to do study groups. She's been meeting with people around the country, up north, as it were, and just now is getting going on their nonprofit. And I do think the Canadian process for nonprofiting is a longer process anyhow. And after we talked a little bit, I just laughed. I said, well, we typical Americans, we did the opposite. We immediately formed a 501c3, and we pulled, fortunately, Guy was really capable, and Jennifer as well, and had some resources together to be able to credential, and some really nice processes for people to walk through that. though I should say, side note for anyone listening who might be interested, like we really take serious if people have had a lot of experience in ministry. So we're not particularly interested if someone has spent a few years in another space to have to make them jump through a bunch of hoops. But
Well, let's talk about
anyhow,
that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, let's talk about that, because certainly in my neck of the woods, at least I'll say, like, those of us who have been through div school and gone through an ordination process, and I think you've gone to seminary, right?
That's right. They don't claim me, but I've been.
Like, at least speaking for my friends, we kind of get super annoyed at those who get like the online ordination, and then like go do their friend's wedding. So
Right.
I don't think you guys want to do like that kind of thing, or at least I'll say I hope not. But what's kind of like is there some like guiding principles, some shared theology, that sort of thing that really provides some cohesion?
Yeah. So a couple of things. First of all, yeah, I agree with you. We're not trying to rubber stamp stuff, and we're trying to walk the line between that and also not forcing people. Like, let's say for my purposes, I had been a pastor and have a master's and a doctorate and had been doing this for basically, a quarter of a century.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't interested in, and it's part of the reason I didn't jump into some other denominations. I was just not interested in going through all the hoops again.
Yeah.
So we're trying to kind of walk that line between, we definitely want to vet people and have integrity with what we're doing, but also not make it a thing where they have to start over.
Mm-hmm.
So theologically, where Dana and I come from, and the trajectory of OpenTable.network is open and relational theology.
Mm-hmm.
And so if people are familiar with that or process theology, they're going to, already be kind of well on their way to understanding what we're trying to do. And if you go to OpenTable.network, you'll see our values. You'll see, again, we tried to keep that sparse, but I'm really proud of the way that stuff turned out and some of the things that we're interested in. I think people will catch a sense right away of who we are and what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So I think as this will release, a couple weeks ago, I did an interview with Ted Smith, who wrote a book about the decline, really, of theological education and the voluntary association as the primary kind of like sociological institutional model. And he talked about denominations kind of turning into the word he uses, affinity groups. And obviously there's some real pluses and minuses. I think we'd both agree for that sort of thing. Like for one, you said it straight out, like folks who are LGBTQ or on that, in that context, like they're obviously in this context, they're going to find a welcoming and inclusion much more than they might find in some other contexts, or certainly not at all in certain contexts. But obviously some dangers of affinity groups is there can be very much like an echo chamber, certainly exclusionary in their own right. So what do you think, like broadly speaking, as we see this kind of trend increase in our culture and, even in our faith traditions, this is kind of a hard question, I suppose, but like, how do you think about that in relation to Open Table Network?
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And we are an affinity group at some level. It feels like so many of us, I have these conversations every week, sometimes almost every day, where I'm meeting new people who are still, I mean, loosely speaking, like generally speaking, you would say they're still interested in Jesus, but they've been so underwhelmed and disillusioned with the institutionalized approach. Mm-hmm. And so there's hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, probably millions of believers who are kind of in these interesting waters. And then a bunch of us who used to be like leaders or whatever our titles were, mm-hmm. who are now trying to figure out how to navigate all this. It's very, very interesting. And yeah, I think what we've said is like tribes are important, but what we're trying to do is not give way to tribalism. Mm-hmm. So if you can get a tribe without tribalism, I think that's super important psychologically, sociologically. emotionally, spiritually, and we're human beings. We're wired to be connected.
Right.
So it's important to do. But I think moving forward, people who have intellectual integrity about all of this are going to be more and more invited into situations where they're just going to hold to their denominational ties, their association ties, their affinity groups with, they're just going to probably hold them more loosely. It doesn't mean that they're less important. It's just, good Lord, pluralism is such a reality in our world now. It doesn't make any sense to try to force love into one, small little pocket. Love works in small little pockets. God, by faith, I think God can fit anywhere. I don't think there's any God-forsaken space in the cosmos.
Right.
But I don't think that's the healthiest way forward. So yeah, we're trying to do the tribe without tribalism.
So obviously, we've seen the danger of institutions in that there is this just protect the institution at all costs. We're both sports fans, so the NFL has been protect the shield. It's protect the league's identity, integrity at all costs.
Yeah.
Certainly we've seen that in denominations. We've seen that in big churches where it's protect the denomination. Catholicism protect the church. In big churches, it's protect the pastor's brand, protect the church's brand. Conversely though, again, I'm thinking about this sociologically, there does need to be some level of commitment or covenanting or stickiness to keep people together. So how do you see, you can answer this kind of how you want to, whether it's from an open table perspective, from thinking about groups of believers organizing in the future. What do you think is going to be necessary to kind of maintain that, what I think is an important balance, not leaning too far the other?
Yeah, it's something to be managed, isn't it? It's not a problem to be fixed once and for all. I think it's constantly ebbing and flowing, in part because our contexts ebb and flow, and our culture and our societies, and even, to some degree, morality, because it's based on customs and culture and systems, and all of these things change over time. So I know one of the things that we're trying to do, and something I personally believe in, is, we're just constantly, as we meet and talk about these things, we're committed to not building ivory towers and giant headquarters and some big place from which all the mandates are decreed from. Instead of that approach, we're trying to say things like, we are here to empower local missional communities. So basically, if you've got an idea that's working or something you want to do, we're going to try to get behind you rather than the other way around. And that was always, I know I won't be the only one who feels this way. As there were good things about the denomination I was part of, but there was always a sense. I said, even when I was a 20-something and I didn't know anything, I was always like, it's just weird how it feels like the pastors exist for the benefit of the denomination. It should freaking be the other way around. It should not be that way. And so yeah, we're just trying to keep that in mind. And I think moving forward in general, no matter what group you're part of, because it's the local missional things that really wind up making so much of the difference. Kind of like politics, we get all wound up about who's going to be the next president. Meanwhile, I don't know what the percentage is, but there's a high percentage of, it's never even going to matter whether Trump or Biden is, for me personally, is the next president. It's about, state legislation and local and community. So I think keeping that in mind, whatever happens, is really important.
Yeah, I'm glad you made that point about, I think some of the clergy I know would agree, who work in some contexts. So I'm thinking, as someone who grew up independent in an independent Baptist tradition where there was no formal denominational ties, there was very loose networks. And then again, I currently am ordained in a mainline tradition that is pretty rigid, pretty organized, and certainly other mainline traditions are even more so, with higher barriers of entry and higher regulations. Certainly, certainly we've talked about some of the negatives of denominations and institutions. Certainly one positive, I think, would be kind of accountability and you just kind of keep an eye on folks. Like I'm thinking about one of the real problems in when we think about like the SBC, Southern Baptist, like they're a denomination, but they're not very top down, obviously, right? At least as I understand it. So certainly there's that big kind of scandal where they're just churches were just kind of turn a blind eye to offenders and passing the buck along, where with a more top heavy approach, I mean, I say it won't work, but it obviously happened within Catholicism. But theoretically, right? Theoretically, the system is supposed to kind of keep those things from happening. So what do you think the dangers are? Not necessarily just within open table, but in these kind of looser structures, like whether it be certainly harm is one way, but theological. I purity don't love the word, but I think you can get a sense of what I'm saying, right? Theological cohesion, maybe we'll say it that way.
Yeah, it's almost like pick your poison, man.
Right.
If you're going to do ministry in the postmodern age that we live in, which is how I kind of reference it, you're going to have a tribe, and you don't have to. You can go out and do your own thing, but there are lots of, like we said, positive things associated with it. By the way, there may be a pension associated with it, a paycheck or something like that. Those were the good old days, weren't they?
Yeah.
And what I used to always say when I was church planting was, when I was a part of the Church of the Nazarene, was, we're doctrinally and fiscally accountable to these people, which I always thought, especially as a church plant, when you're starting with nothing, was a really healthy thing. And in theory it is, until the doctrine gets all skewed, and even the finances at times can get skewed. So it is not an easy, there's no one fix. It's not an easy thing. Open table, I feel good about it in the sense that I can tell you this, it has never been my dream to start a denomination or an association or whatever the heck we call ourselves. That was never a part of my 5-year, 20-year plan. It's just emerged because there's obviously such a need for it. And we're in such an, again, awkward, interesting phase. And so here we are, me and my colleagues, and we have some experience. We've been around. We've got a few intelligent things to say. We've also got a lot of unintelligent things to say. So we just thought, well, we're going to put this together and see if we can help people. But yeah, you're asking great questions, because there are no perfect answers to this for sure.
Well, I think what I'm hearing from you, and this is a position that I've been coming to more and more late, is so much as I try to live according to is just trying to hold this tension between two things. And obviously, like, it's easy to get pulled in one direction or another. And I hear a lot of that in what you're saying.
I think so. I think that's the way to live life personally. I think that's the way more and more people are living life. All of our institutions, whether they're economic, political, religious, national, military, they're full of cracks and crevices. Actually, they always have been.
Right.
It's just because of probably because of the internet, because of the fact that we get news, up to the second news, and we see problems everywhere. It's just in our face. So we're just aware of it more than ever. And I started to say dangerous time. I don't like that word because there's also a lot of potential. It's just a very interesting, potentially good, potentially bad time. And so for folks out there, men or women who have, or people who are in some kind of non-binary state there too, I should say, who have felt a call and an invitation to be, again, a pastor or a counselor, a spiritual director, a leader, a chaplain. It takes a lot out of you to kind of figure out, how do you want to move forward with all of that? And I think living in the tension is a Jesus move. I think it's a embodied love move. And I think it's the only thing we can really do. We don't need to do it and be disrespectful of other institutions, although, well, I'll say it this way. We don't need to be disrespectful of people in other institutions. I personally kind of don't really care that much if we're disrespectful to the institution itself.
Sure, I can live with that. Yeah.
Some of these systems, man, they've been living off the fat of the hog, so to speak, for, at least 18 centuries since the time of Constantine. And it's just not right. I mean, it took 1,800 years for us to figure out slavery was wrong. It took 1,900 years to figure out women should vote. It's taken us, a couple thousand years to figure out queer folk are like real live human beings. And all of that was perpetrated, again, good people, but the systems themselves can get really skewed and sideways. So yeah, I keep saying the same thing. We just live in an interesting time, and it takes a lot of courage to keep moving forward on all of this.
So let's talk about moving forward. I think, and I imagine you'd probably agree, we're going to continue to see denominations splinter and split and diminish. I mean, I think, frankly, that's going to be a big draw for like your open table. What do you think? I mean, do you think this is a trend? Do you think you're kind of ahead of the curve? What do you see?
Well, I always try to get ahead of the curve, but it seems like I never quite am. But it seems like I get hit by the curveball.
Yeah.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. I think, yes, there's going to be more fractures and splinters. And on one level, it's nuts because we have already, depending on, I hear 30,000, maybe 40,000, just Protestant denominations alone, not even counting Eastern Orthodox and Catholic and all that. So, good Lord, we don't need any more splintering. On the other hand, there's something good about it too, because the splintering splits you up into smaller groups, and again, kind of like the local missional things. And so maybe I think there's some really positive stuff about that. I don't see it going anywhere else. There's no chance that there's going to be one big mega church, one big mega denomination, unless, something like Christian nationalism, might be able to pull, which they already kind of do to some degree. And that's a nauseating thought. By the way, Christian nationalism, for the listener, I don't mean just conservative. I mean, there's liberal Christian nationalism too, but the conservative one is kind of the one that's more in your face and kind of more gross.
So. Right. Yeah. I wanted to say one more point on this too. Like I'm thinking about, like in my conversation with Carol Howard and also with Ted Smith, the point came up about how, especially with some denominations, and you kind of alluded to this, like there's so many hoops to jump through that as the pastor as a profession becomes more and more, or I should say less and less financially sustainable, I do think it's important for us to have credentialing, to use that word, ordaining models that don't require an MDiv or don't require seminary debt. So I think that's another reason why your model is intriguing, because I think it's going to be important, to have other models or avenues to some kind of ministry credentialing that aren't going to require, such rigid standards.
I know it's tricky. We got to have standards.
It is tricky.
Especially if you're leading people. There's so many needs. I mean, to be we'll just say spiritual leader, for lack of a better phrase, to be that in any day and age, for sure. But the day and age we live in, it's complicated, man. There's so much mimetic dysfunction out there. There's so much politics. There's so much, spiritual manipulation and weirdness, and people come into your practice or your church that are strange, and they project all this stuff on you. Not to mention, like, you got to have ways to figure out how to read your sacred text, in our case, the Bible. And if you don't have some education, we'd all love to say, well, love will just lead us. But as you and I both know, there's some really complicated stuff. So yeah, just trying to walk that line between encouraging education, but not incurring all this debt, figuring out ways to stay educated and not have to do kind of the traditional route, which is what you're saying that people have done and have put them in a really tough position financially. So yeah, it's interesting.
Whoever's listening to this is probably like, are these guys going to make up their mind? Like they're talking all over the place, like on both sides. And
Right.
I think that's really the case.
Right.
Like we're trying to acknowledge like the complexity of this and like, like as those words were coming out of my mouth, I'm like, oh man, but I do really value theological education. I do really value like rigid, ethics and ethical guidelines, but also, it's a both and tension thing. Like I think has been the theme of this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, one good thing is we live now in this time period, obviously, with the internet and so many resources. I mean, this is unprecedented in the history of humanity. So, people can get educated now in ways that, if they wanted to, could be a lot less expensive in the past. Part of the problem is, do we recognize, those people? Do we recognize, for example, and that's part of the reason why at opentable.network, we're not making people who've pastored for 20 years jump through a bunch of hoops, because we want to recognize the fact that experience, that counts for something. It means something that you can't get in a seminary classroom or, from a traditional thing. So it's just I'll muddy the waters even more by saying that there's got to be ways moving forward where we can informally formalize the way someone can learn theologically, psychologically, emotionally. And we're kind of open to those things at Open Table. We're trying to play catch up with a lot of it, but I think that's a really interesting discussion.
Yeah, it is. I want to shift the conversation because I feel like we could stay in these muddy waters forever, but I want to shift the conversation towards, I think, a subplot or a sub-theme of this. And that's to grief. And it's even hard to talk about, I think. And you're well acquainted with grief. You have a book you wrote on grief. You mentioned the loss of your daughter and how that shaped your family's life. I'm thinking about this as I wrestle with my own grief, just thinking about my own professional career in ministry, or it seems like a lack thereof moving forward. I think about folks like yourself who committed so many years to a denomination or a tradition only to find themselves at odds or even actively, transitioned out of those traditions or churches or what have you. Have you encountered such a situation at an Open Table? Whether you want to speak to this personally or professionally, share more about that if you would.
Yeah, thank you for asking, and thank you for asking it in that way, because Lauren, I think that is a big piece of what is going on across the country. I mean, it's not like I travel a lot, but I'm in and out, and I talk to quite a few people in a lot of different situations. And I would say one of the on the short list of common denominators that is connecting a lot of American Christian, spiritual sojourners at this point is this idea of grief. It's the idea that this thing just did not go like we thought it was going to go.
Right.
The dream of whatever that church was, or that pastorate was, or even if you haven't been a pastor, especially when you get to be my age. I'm a little bit older than you, but I'm in my 50s. I'm a grandpa now, by the way. Got a 2-month-old granddaughter. Did I show you a picture last week of my granddaughter?
I don't know. We'll have to do it here when we're done.
I probably should have.
Yeah.
But when you get to be my age, it's funny. My partner and I, we talk all the time. She was just saying something about this the other night, but how, when you've been serving in the church for lots of years and you get to be our age, you're like, everyone's pretty much done. They're so tired. They've been through so many battles.
Yeah.
And then you add on top of all the craziness that's happened in our world over the last, 10, 20 years. And then if you add any personal stuff like she and I have been through, you just realize that life is like you go from one expectation to the next. And it's very frustrating. So I think a lot of people are grieving. They're grieving the loss. And you don't have to have been, I hope you haven't been someone like me who's lost a kid. You may have lost a marriage, or it just may have been death of a dream, or death of the way you thought things were going to go. What is interesting is, well, there's a lot of things, but essentially Jesus said, this whole dealing with loss thing, it's a prerequisite for joy. Because he said, blessed are those who mourn. So maybe, again, back to the theme we already kind of talked about, maybe we're living in a day and age when it's both deeply troubling and problematic and hurtful, but also deeply replete, full of the possibility of blessing. Because if we can just, like, there's this fine line between, what do I want to say? Fine line between like complaining about something. And I'm hesitant about that because I think there are times when you complain, and trust me, having been through what we've been through, I've complained a few days, but there's a fine line between that and lament.
Yeah.
Mourning and, also nihilism. And by the way, not to plug my book, but Indigo, The Color of Grief really is an attempt at one level to try to be intellectually honest. Sorry, I think that's a fourth or fifth time I said that phrase.
No, it's fine. Yeah.
It's trying to be honest with how you can go really hard one way or the other. Like when you go through loss, you can really double down on the old, like if you're a Christian, you can double down on the old, maybe holiness codes or, behavioral modification. And go really lean hard into God's control. Or you can go crazy the other way and nihilistic and say, there is no God. And I can have a measure of respect for both. I probably have maybe a little more respect for the latter than the former, but it feels like living in the tension between the two is where you kind of have to be. And we're just not great at that. Our institutions haven't conditioned us to do that, but I can't blame it all in the institutions because personally, it's just not what I signed up for with life. I was looking for more black and white, kind of really, really, really positive answers versus all this gray. But yeah, I think you're right to frame it in a perspective of grief, because I think a lot of people are struggling with that.
And I think what makes this so hard, if I can be honest, is like as clergy, we're the trained caregiver in most contexts that we're in, A, and then B, because our profession tends to be tied to our spiritual community. When we leave that profession, we tend to leave that spiritual community. Like my daughter, who's like a preteen, she's like, Dad, we've changed churches so much. I'm like, because I work for a church.
Yeah.
Or have. Like, that's a hard dynamic, isn't it?
Yeah, just adding to the complexity that we've already. Man, people tuning in who aren't pastors, they're like, they should be so grateful they're not pastors right now. Yeah, another thing I thought of when you said that too, we're caregivers, and then to be pushed out, kicked out, in my case officially, in lots of other places unofficially, it's a mind trip. We're also lots of us are kind of like, when you're clergy, you play like a meaning-making role in your little community. So when bad things happen, you help people make meaning.
Right.
But what's crazy is when bad things happen, like if it's bad enough, like for example, in my situation, my entire meaning-making system, just kind of fell apart.
Right.
So now I was trying to create meaning in the middle of chaos.
Right.
And the poor people who had to come to my church, I mean, I say poor people, some of them were really, really great and learned a lot. That's a whole interesting dynamic too. And I think a lot of meaning-making clergy types, counselor, chaplain types are in that position. Their lives personally are being unwound, sometimes in really beautiful, but the beauty is always attached to the dark, really bad stuff too. And so to navigate all that at the same time you're trying to create meaning for others, holy smoke, what a trip that is.
Man, this is tough stuff, but I think good stuff, and I hope it's resonating with the listeners. Let me ask you one more question here before we move on. So again, I'm going to refer back to my current conversation with Ted Smith, and he talked about the model of like a chaplain as being a really kind of like future model because it kind of signifies you as like a spiritual leader, but not necessarily tied to a institution, like a pastor's, doesn't have to be, but is often tied to a church, often a specific church, where a chaplain, for instance, the hospital chaplain, even a corporate chaplain may or may not work for that actual institution. Do you see, have you thought about like how Open Table might be a part of that, or what that kind of model even might look like, of a spiritual leader, not necessarily tied to an institution?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I don't know if I've formally thought through that. Informally, I think so, because it's kind of my world and your world too. We kind
Right.
of are in it all the time.
Yeah.
Some of it is like your response to like, well, what kind of title do you want, and what is the connotation of that title?
Right, because
I think
I want to
yeah.
call myself a pastor because I think pastorally, and I care for people pastorally, but pastors are by and large connected, like they're seen as being connected to a church in a leadership role, and that's not where I am right now.
Right. I think this speaks to the need for expanded imagination around our language.
Yeah. Yeah.
And language is, it's important. We got to have it, obviously. It's fundamental to who we are, but we just get so locked into certain things. So while we're expanding our theological paradigms and perspectives and imagination, the language is all a part of it too. I agree. Like, it's funny. I've been a pastor most of my life. I still do pastoral things. I still talk to people every single day. People text me or email me, message me. By the way, you can't Facebook me right now because Facebook just suspended my account. So that's pretty interesting. Yeah. But I'm not really a pastor. Like chaplain, I totally agree with what Ted and what you're saying. I think, but also that word to me, the connotation, and it's probably just my own stuff. It's probably a great word, but it seems passive in some sense.
Yeah.
Some senses.
Yeah, I think that's a fair.
I don't like that.
Yeah.
But then again, I don't need an aggressive, like, I used to be part of a pretty relatively evangelical church planning network that in retrospect, now that I have some years behind me, I realize was really informed more by competitive American exceptionalism and toxic masculinity than it is anything else. So if I had to choose between passive and that, I'd go passive.
Boy,
I'm trying to come up with a name. I saw something today where the guy said he was get this, he said he was a solvum probler. A solvum probler.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought,
how do you spell that then?
Solvum, SOLVEM, probler, PROBLER.
Oh, I was thinking that was like SOUL, like solve them problem.
Well, could be, but it's a takeoff, obviously, problem solver. He's a solvum probler. And I'm like, okay, I like that. But that's just silly. Like, I used to call myself, what did I used to call myself? Oh, the most recent church plant, I called myself lead follower.
Mm-hmm.
For 10 years, I did that. And that always led to interesting discussions. Before that, I was spiritual environmentalist at the church plant before that.
Yeah.
So I'm always playing with that, trying to figure out what these words mean and trying to break out of the stereotypical molds of what these things mean. But the greater point is plurality is a reality in our world. We need lots of people in all different walks of life who are feeling esteemed by their tribes, also feeling self-esteemed, feeling esteemed by God and love, to step forward and to lead, as much as I have a conflicted relationship with the word lead or leadership.
Mm-hmm.
But that stuff's really important. And so we all just need to step up and try to figure out how to create those spaces and those names and those titles.
Boy, it goes back to our theme of earlier, holding that tension, holding that balance between the two, right?
Yep.
Well,
absolutely.
Usually I build on a break here, but I kind of want to just stay with this momentum and ask you this silly question, Jonathan. Okay. Because, like, you are, in some ways, like the highest level denominational official I've ever interviewed.
That's really funny, man, and really sad.
No, and I'm actually hoping to get my denominational lead person on here soon, but I'm kind of being loose with the term denomination, and I guess that's what I'm making a play on words here, is that you're co-founder of a denomination, so you're like co-president of a denomination. So this is the question. If you expanded your influence and you're, some might call it a pope for a day, what would you want to do with that influence for a day?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's pretty funny. When we started this thing, I told my friend Dana, I'll help however, but I wasn't going to be the president. So he's the president on the papers. So he's the official guy. Um, I'm helping him. I just say that to make sure if Dana listens to this, that he knows that I have
Sure.
absolved myself of all responsibility.
Yeah.
That's pretty funny. What would I want to do for the day? It would have to be something around like just helping people reapproach the concept of love. I think that the essence of God is love. I think it's biblical. I think philosophically it makes the most sense. I think practically speaking, it makes the most sense. What's been interesting in my journey, well, there's a lot of things that have been interesting, but one thing that's been interesting is I didn't realize I was doing this, but when I set out on this new journey, I actually, in many ways, was redefining love. In the old days, love was, I'm not really sure what it was. It had something to do with hierarchy and sacrifice and doing the right thing and morality. And some of that still plays in.
Yeah.
But now when I think of love, I go, it's this uncontrolling, non-binary, non-scapegoating, non-violent energy that's in a relationship with God and with others. And it's meant for good and blessing in the world. And every single one of those words are pretty well vetted in my life. I mean, I've written some books about them. I mean, they may not be good books, but I mean, I've put some words behind them, and I've spoken a few times about them. And I've logged a lot of hours staring at the ceiling and again, taking hikes and walks in all parts of the country, trying to figure out what I think. And so it's fascinating. Each one of those things are really important concepts. And so if I had well, you're asking if I could make a mandate. Well, that's
Right.
completely it's completely antithetical to open a relational theology.
Yes.
If this is a consensual thing, then I can't make a mandate. But I would highly encourage, invite everyone into deeper and deeper instantiations of love.
You would seek to persuade them, right?
I would lay out the lure.
Yes.
I would invite them and persuade them, to do my best to persuade them to think even more deeply, to throw off the shackles of the myth of redemptive sacrifice and to lean into the freedom and the grace of love.
Well, this is good. You really leaned into that quite well. So thank you for engaging that question. So since you mentioned your books here, I do want to give you some opportunity to plug the books, because I've had the privilege of reading, I think all three of your books here, right? The Reconstructionist. What's the second one?
Theology of Consent.
Theology of Consent. And then the one you just released, Indigo, which I just want to say, like, I don't know if this is good or bad, Jonathan, for you, but like, I have not fully engaged it because it's like so raw and deep that I've had to like flip through it and look at stuff. And I don't know if I've been in a space where I can fully engage that. So I guess it speaks to, I think, the richness and depthness of that book. But say anything else you want to say about your works there.
Thank you for inviting me to say stuff. Yeah, you're not the only one who's done that with Indigo. I've had a lot of even of closer friends who have picked it up, and even family members. Yeah, actually, my sister just told me a couple of weeks ago, and it's funny because she's always one of my biggest fans. I mean, I tell you what, Lauren, everyone needs a big sister in their life who's a big fan, and she has. All three of my sisters have been big fans. But anyhow, she told me a couple of weeks ago she was an early reader back before it was published, but she hasn't read it yet, and it sits by her bedside because she's just got to get in the right frame of mind Now it's probably not good. I'm scaring people. I will say it's on audio, so that might be easier. It might be easier to listen to it than turn pages. But yeah, that's been an important book for me. Reconstructionist was important. That gives a little insight into how I kind of rewound when I decided I wasn't just going to deconstruct, but I wanted to reconstruct.
Yeah.
And I decided to do it around 3 basic things. Well, I didn't decide. I realized after the fact that 3 things had basically happened to me. And that is that all my questions I was having, I kept running through these 3 filters. One was mercy is greater than sacrifice. And number 2 is people are greater than the text. And number 3 is love is greater than fear.
Yeah.
What I discovered was every question I had theologically, every question I had about human sexuality, about omnipotence, the Bible, all these things, eschatology. When I worked all of my questions through those 3 filters, and when I came out on love, people, and mercy, that's the kind of theology I wanted. So that's the Reconstructionist. It's with Choir Publishing, and then Theology of Consent is back with Sacrisage, and that's about mimetic theory it's me talking about how I think mimetic theory is wired, and then how I think open and relational theology is wired, and then I cross the wires and I watch the smoke fly and try to come up with something of depth there. I also have a nice little book with the snappy title, Questions About Sexuality That Got Me Uninvited from My Denomination.
Rolls off the tongue there.
Just rolls right off the tongue. There's so many words on the cover, you can't even quite fit it on the cover. But yeah, so thanks for asking about the books.
Yeah, and I'll just give a plug. I know we're running long here, but like the Reconstructionist, what is it? Mercy over sacrifice, love over text. What's the third one again?
People are greater than the text.
Oh, people.
Mercy is greater than sacrifice, and love is greater than fear.
Oh, yeah, love's greater. I think those are really, really solid foundational pieces. And hopefully, I don't think I'm misrepresenting you having read the book. Like, you're not like throwing out sacrifice or the text or fear. You're saying
that's right.
If you're saying
that's
like,
right.
Again, to that balance and tension, like if we got to choose one or the over, like we choose mercy over sacrifice, we choose people over text. Like, because again, like Jesus said, I think the Sabbath is meant to serve the people, not people Sabbath, right?
Right. No, it's a really important point. Like even with sacrifice, what it required me to do, and I show my work in theology of consent on this. It required me to go back and to think in terms of, well, okay, some sacrifice is good. Like there's altruistic sacrifice. There's giving your life away. But what it boiled down to, the long and short of it was consent became the thing for me. I was like, oh, agency, empowerment, individual like consent. Like God's not forcing anybody to sacrifice, but love will invite you. And when you're invited and you consent to it, it'll take you down an interesting journey. But if you don't, love's not going to forsake you. So it's that kind of stuff. And you're right. I'm not trying to disregard all the other stuff. I'm just saying, oh no, there's a healthier way to work through these things.
Yeah. Well, this is good stuff. We got to get going here. So how can people connect with you? Give your website. That's the thing.
Sure. Thanks. JonathanFosterOnline.com is the website. They can go there, find out about the books. They can sign up for my Substack newsletter. They can find out about the work we're doing in Haiti, and any number of things they can find out there.
And the super titled podcast, Jonathan_Foster.
That's right. They can find out about Jonathan_Foster podcast with the coolest probably name in the history of all podcasts.
Well, I really appreciate your time and the conversation. Always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romick-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.